Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks everybody for having me and spending some Friday time with us. And the story I'm going to tell you today is about our new Alzheimer's drug called Xanamem. We have some new clinical trial results in mild disease patients with Alzheimer's disease showing a really strong clinical effect. And this drug works in a different way than the amyloid antibodies that have been quite sort of famously called effective recently, but they are only modestly effective. And it's the validation of a new hypothesis around the stress hormone cortisol that is lowered by our drug. So with this, I'm going to show you to the next couple of slides and give you an overview of where we are and the new data. To the next slide, please. I will be making forward-looking statements, as you would expect. A little corporate snapshot there. We are on the ASX, as Tim said, market cap around 220 million. The primary shareholders are a US fund called the BVF Partners Fund, based in San Francisco and New York, myself, and the originators of the technology, Edinburgh University, who were the original chemistry group that made a fantastic small molecule, a once-a-day pill. So the next slide, please. We have a very experienced board of directors and management team. We are a semi-hybrid corporate model, and we are hiring the best people around the world to help us in the pursuit of both Alzheimer's disease and depression. Next slide. And a bit about the molecule itself. So this is a once-a-day low-dose oral pill with a unique mechanism. And as I mentioned, this is not an amyloid mechanism, which is where most of the big companies in the world have been putting their money for the last 20 years, but it's a way of reducing the stress hormone cortisol, known to be toxic to brain cells and associated with poor memory and Alzheimer's disease. And the drug has the potential to be rapidly cognitive enhancing, meaning it can improve the way people remember things and think quite quickly within a few weeks. It can be disease modifying potentially, meaning to slow or halt progression in Alzheimer's, and I'll talk about the new data there. And it may well be an antidepressant as well. And so we're exploring all of these things in our program. Next slide. So at today's date, we have treated about 300 people safely in trials using Xanamem once or twice a day up to 12 weeks in duration. We've seen positive effects on attention and working memory, or so-called cognition, in 2 independent placebo-controlled trials in healthy older patients. And last week, we reported a large therapeutic benefit in patients with mild early-stage Alzheimer's disease who had a positive biomarker for that disease, and I'll explain what that means. And most importantly, the effect was seen in an FDA-approved endpoint called the CDR sum of boxes, which is widely used and has been used for an FDA approval recently for an anti-amyloid drug. So in the coming months, we're starting a depression trial. The XanaSID trial, it's called, will measure cognitive impairment in depression as well as depression, and that starts in the next month or two here in Australia, and we'll get results in 2023. And the phase 2B, next larger Alzheimer's disease study, will start in the first half of next year. To the next slide, please. So what are these new results that are so exciting for us and make us believe this drug may well be the best Alzheimer's drug in the world? Well, in this analysis, twice as many patients in the treated group had stable or improved disease compared with placebo. In other words, there was a doubling of stabilization rates. This is quite a big effect. More than half the patients treated with the drug were stable or improved, and this represented a 60 to 80% reduction in disease progression versus placebo. And to put that into context, an amyloid antibody called lecanemab was recently reported to have a 27% relative reduction of progression over an 18-month period. And here we're seeing 60 to 80% over a 12-week period. So the bottom line really is that these data suggested that Xanamem protected the majority of patients with mild disease from progression. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to treat patients with the early stages of Alzheimer's so they can stay at home, be independent, and lead relatively healthy, independent lives for several years longer. Next slide, please. One very data-heavy slide just to explain what we did. The previous phase 2 study, which studied mild Alzheimer's disease patients, studied 185 people. 72 of those had some stored blood samples that we could measure biomarkers in. And of those, about 34 had elevated levels of the one we were mainly interested in, called p-tau or phosphorylated tau. So we divided that group into the top 50% and the lower 50%. And the top 50% are known to have a strong relationship to brain amyloid or essentially pathologic Alzheimer's disease. And so what we saw in that sort of more disease-prone group was a significant improvement in Xanamem treatment versus placebo, with a big effect size measured by a statistic called Cohen's d, and a p-value that was nearly statistically significant. Compared to an amyloid antibody, they see about a 0.4 or 0.45 improvement. We're seeing a 0.6 or a 0.8 improvement over a much shorter time. Similarly, in a very high p-tau group, we saw a similar result. So a clinically significant and highly interesting result on an FDA-approved endpoint in the target population of mild Alzheimer's disease patients. Next slide. As well as Alzheimer's, we're investigating depression, and there's a really interesting opportunity here because antidepressants don't really improve cognition associated with depression terribly well. They may improve mood, but a lot of people don't get their foggy thinking improved. Whereas we've shown that Xanamem already improves cognition quickly in healthy older volunteers. And indeed, the cortisol literature suggests that in clinical tests of other molecules that fiddle with the cortisol system, you can see improved depression. So the hope here is that Xanamem may have a dual action to improve both depression and cognitive impairment. To the next slide, please. So we just summarize in this slide where we are with our current program. So we've, as I mentioned, treated more than 300 people to date in phase 1 and phase 2A. We've got this new biomarker analysis that suggests that biomarker positive patients will be suitable for selection in a phase 2B study of Alzheimer's disease, which is starting next year. In that program, we'll also be talking to the FDA and the EMA quite quickly about the design of pivotal trials. And we will be using our 2B marketed or commercial tablet formulation so that the phase 2B can be considered as one of 2 or 3 pivotal studies for early registration. So the hope is that with our program in Alzheimer's disease, we could get a registration as early as within 5 years from now. For depression, we're doing more of a proof of concept phase 2A, looking at both cognitive impairment and depression itself in patients. And that study starts in the next months or two, hopefully reads out in 2023, and we'll start a phase 3 after that. Next slide, please. So our strategy really hasn't changed, although it's certainly been validated by our new results. And we are backed by a strong balance sheet and good intellectual property, which I don't really have time to go into. But the strategy is fundamentally accelerating clinical development to bring this molecule to market as soon as possible. Forward planning, meaning good manufacturing practice, manufacturing and scale up so that we've got commercially ready tablets, doing all of the necessary regulatory studies and discussing all of that with the appropriate FDA supervisors. And then on the right-hand side, very focused now on creating value from partnerships. While we always engage with potential pharma and biotech partners, these new results give us a really interesting discussion to seek value-add partnerships and especially evaluate closely potential regional opportunities where we could potentially improve the clinical trial program and bring in some non-dilutive funding. And regulatory engagement, we will be seeking various discussions with the US FDA and EMA to accelerate the program and bring forward the date of approval for both Alzheimer's disease and hopefully depression. Next slide. And finally, the next few months in 2022 are going to be busy with multiple partnering presentations of the new results. We have a new presentation at a big Alzheimer's disease conference in November in San Francisco. We'll be starting enrollment for our depression trial and filing a number of key global regulatory submissions. In 2023, hopefully we'll see the depression results as well as start the Alzheimer's phase 2B study, and a number of peer-reviewed presentations and publications will be published. And then 2024, we expect the results of the Xanamem phase 2B, and we may indeed start a phase 3 Alzheimer's study as early as 2023 or 2024. in parallel with that phase 2b study. And we'll be expanding both depression and Alzheimer's programs in 2024, and potentially looking, depending on partnership opportunities, to expand the program into other disease areas. And then with that, that was probably a quick overview. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Stephen. I appreciate that's not a lot of time to cover a lot of different subjects. Now, with a drug like this that has such important applications or dual applications, how do you kind of manage the benefits of it? If you're looking at depression, you're looking at Alzheimer's, how do you determine where it's best application? And once you have the data, and is it also a combination of market size and things like that? And then when you take that to the FDA, does it go there with dual applications, or how's that managed?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it's a nice problem to have if you've got a drug that works beautifully at the same dose in multiple different diseases. That's the ideal situation, and that's been managed quite successfully by other pharma companies before. For example, in the arthritis area, it's quite common to have a bunch of different diseases that are covered by the same dosing regimen and label. However, as you develop the drug, obviously you have parallel programs. Often there are different agencies or sub-agencies within the FDA that deal with your application. So you do have to be careful about coordinating all of that. And you do, of course, need different experts. Depression experts are different often than Alzheimer's experts. And so you need different groups of people advising you and, of course, helping you with the clinical trials. So it does add complexity to the program. It does add some diversification in terms of risk. At this stage, given we've got 3 clinical trials in the Alzheimer's area and showing improved cognition in different ways, we think the Alzheimer's program is really quite de-risked. And that is probably also true to a certain extent, but a lesser extent with depression, as we haven't really got any depression data quite yet.
And so what's the plan to kind of fund these developments moving forward?
Yeah, so look, we're in a very strong position currently with our cash. At the end of the June quarter, we had 20 million in cash, including a receivable, which is pretty good. Our cash burn's been about 3 million a quarter in recent times. That will step up slowly as we move into these next clinical trials. We're really focused on partnership opportunities because this is such a big, to have the world's best Alzheimer's drug is a huge possibility. And the way to accelerate that is to look at doing the appropriate value-add partnerships. So we'll be looking to bring in additional resources through those partnerships. And that's my job for the next few months, is to really get out there and make that happen. And then we are, of course, looking that there are a number of granting bodies that fund programs in Alzheimer's disease in particular. And that's certainly something we're pursuing as well.
And sorry, how does that work with the partnerships? So I'm assuming kind of big pharma here. Do you reach out for them? Do they validate your data? How does it kind of come about?
Yeah, it's a long process, but it's a process we started years ago. So there's a long list of companies very interested in Alzheimer's disease and depression. They're not always exactly the same companies, but a lot of them are interested in both. And so we talk to them about the data. We get some feedback often from their internal experts about what they think about the programs and how they think about certain endpoints for future trials. And we develop a relationship. And so we have strong relationships with nearly all of the neuroscience players around the world. And there's some strong interest from regional players in Asian, Southeast Asian, Central and South American regions, European regions. So there are a number of different ways we could think about deal making in the future. Meanwhile, we're running the company as if we're going to take it all the way to marketing, because even if you do a big global partnership, the asset has to be managed and handed over in mint condition.
Understood. Stephen, that's all we have time for. Really appreciate your time and presentation. Have a nice weekend.
Thanks so much.